Hello, chess fans. Welcome to another edition of Chess Chat, a program designed to give you, the viewer, a better understanding of the fascinating world of chess. I am your host, George Merijanian, Program Director of the Wachusett Chess Club at Fitchburg State University. And with me today at the Fitchburg Access Television Production Center in the control room is our award-winning director, Darren Dame of Fitchburg. He's assisted with the audio by FATV intern and Fitchburg State senior and soon-to-be graduate, Ron Bagnera. And cueing the moves is our two-time Wachusett Chess Club champion, Bruce Felton of Fitchburg. And behind the camera is our staunch Wachusett Chess Club member, Brian Bigelow of Leominster. And last but not least is our longtime colleague, my longtime colleague and associate, Martin Lane of Lunenburg, a former Wachusett Club champion and one of the strongest players in North Central Massachusetts. Well, welcome, Marty.
Hello, George. Good to see you again.
Always a pleasure to see you, Marty. I failed to mention to our viewers, Marty, that the Wachusett Chess Club meets every Wednesday evening from 7 to 11 in room C-159 of the McKay Campus School at Fitchburg State University, and we welcome players of all levels, you know, amateurs and more experienced players. So we're open to everybody in the area and beyond. We just had a player come from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, who's a lecturer of music, a jazz composer, and he just joined the club last week.
And we have players come down from New Hampshire, from
all over
Chelmsford and Westford.
They come from we have one coming from Manchester, New Hampshire every week. Right. So we have players coming from all over the region. Well, Marty, today we're going to present to our viewers a historic game, played by undoubtedly the greatest scientist of the 19th century,
20th century.
Of the 20th century, right, 20th century, right. He was born in the 20th century, Albert Einstein. And this is a game that Albert Einstein played with a celebrated nuclear physicist who I think most of our viewers, many of them would know the name J. Robert Oppenheimer.
Right, two of the great theoretical physicists of the 20th century.
And here's a photo of them together, Einstein on the left with Oppenheimer. And how did they know each other?
Well, both of them were theoretical physicists. Einstein was working at Princeton for the Institute for Advanced Studies. Oppenheimer in the early 1930s, late 1920s, happened to be at Caltech. The first time they met, Einstein had spent a couple of months as a visiting professor there. That's how they first met.
Yes. Later,
Oppenheimer was invited out to the East Coast to head up this Institute for Advanced Studies. And that's where they met, was at Princeton. And they were colleagues and acquaintances and friends for the duration, or for the rest, until the 50s when Einstein passed away. They corresponded. They were both the thing that links them. The giant thing that links the two of them in their careers is the atom bomb. It was Einstein's theory and his work on particle physics that made the bomb possible. J. Robert Oppenheimer was the technical director of the Manhattan Project, a super secret World War II project that made the atom bomb a reality. He took Einstein's theories and made that bomb a reality. And then later, in the course of that, they both became politically active and opposed nuclear proliferation.
Both of them.
Even though they both made it possible, they both turned away from it.
Right.
And advocated for nuclear controls.
Well, Einstein, again, he was born in Germany. He spent his youth in Munich. He moved, in fact, at a very young age, his family moved to Munich, Germany. And it was there as a boy. He said, he told a reporter in 1936 that he played chess as a boy. So it had to be in Munich, during his youth. And it was actually also in Germany in 1927 that he met Emanuel Lasker, who was once upon a time world champion. In fact, he held the world championship for 27 years. Here's a photo of Emanuel Lasker, who has held the world championship longer than any world champion in its history, nearly 27 years. Well, they met in 1927 in Berlin when Einstein was a professor at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Physics, and their friendship lasted until they went their little separate ways in 1933. 1933, Einstein, here's a caricature of Einstein meeting Lasker. They met in 1927, but in 1933, Lasker left Germany, went to England, spent a couple of years there, and then went to the Soviet Union, of all places, for a couple of years, and eventually came to the United States in 1937. Einstein came directly to the United States in 1933, and it was in that year that he came to Princeton, where Oppenheimer was the director, as you say, of the advanced study.
The Institute for Advanced Studies.
Advanced Institute of Study, and he got a position there. Oppenheimer was the director.
Right.
And it was there where this game we're going to present to our viewers was played. It's an historic game.
Right.
It's not a beautiful. We'll tell our viewers.
It's not a grandmaster game.
No, we can be candid enough to say this is not a beautiful game, but it's a very instructive game because it showed that actually Einstein, even as an amateur player, you said something about, for example, his attitude toward chess.
There are two things. Einstein once told a reporter that he didn't play games. The reporter apparently had asked him what he does in his spare time. He preferred playing the violin and sailing, is what he said.
Yes.
However, there are other people who knew Einstein personally that have written that he did enjoy playing chess with friends. He played with neighbors. He liked playing chess with, he would even show children how, introduce them to the moves and then play them later. So he did play offhand games. So when he says he wasn't a chess player, it means he didn't go to a club, he didn't enter tournaments, but he still knew the game and he enjoyed playing the game, but just as an amateur.
Right. So he's humble. He was humble.
And Oppenheimer was born in New York. He was 25 years younger than Einstein. He was born into a very affluent family. The family had immigrated to the United States from Germany in the late 19th century.
There's a photo of Einstein with Oppenheimer. Yeah, there are many photos of them together.
Yeah, they worked a lot together. And I couldn't find out exactly where along the way Oppenheimer learned chess. He had a very classical education. He was very widely read. He had a lot of different interests. But we do know that he played, when he was 17, we came across a game that he played in a simultaneous exhibition against Gyula Breyer, a well-known international player.
Yes, Hungarian player.
Played that when he was 17. So he was familiar with games. So you have two people who enjoy the game, are familiar with it, but they're certainly not top-level players.
Yeah. Now you mentioned this Hungarian player, Breyer. There's actually a Bobby Fischer connection with Oppenheimer.
Right.
There is a physicist by the name of Paul Nemenyi, who was Bobby Fischer's real father, biological father, who worked on the Manhattan Project, who was actually appointed by Oppenheimer on this project. So there's an interesting connection between Bobby Fischer's father and Oppenheimer and the Manhattan Project.
Right.
Well, I think maybe we should get to the game that Einstein played against Oppenheimer from 1933 at Princeton. Who had white in this game?
Okay, Einstein is white, Oppenheimer is black.
Okay, so what did he play as his first move?
Okay, Einstein opened by moving the E2 pawn to E4, King's pawn opening that we've seen on many occasions. It opens up diagonals for the white bishop and the queen, and it occupies the center square.
Okay, so Oppenheimer, in response to E4, he plays E5, plays the pawn to E5. And this is known as, it's a king pawn opening.
Right. Doesn't have a personality yet.
Yes, so. Right. We will see what it turns into by the subsequent moves. So what did Einstein do now for a second move?
Einstein chooses to develop his knight. There's always kind of a rule of thumb that says knights before bishops. He develops the knight on G1 to F3, develops his knight and attacks the E5 pawn.
Okay. So what Oppenheimer did on his second move, he took this knight on B8 and developed it to C6, knight C6 to defend the pawn on E5.
Right.
Okay.
So we've seen this position a number of times. There are lots of choices for white. He can play bishop to C4. Yes. He can simply develop the knight from B1 to C3. He could play D4 from here. I think we've seen that.
Yeah, those are three good alternatives.
Good alternatives.
Yeah,
but Einstein chooses to play the bishop on F1 to B5, making the classic position of the Ruy Lopez of the Spanish game.
Yeah, we've seen this before.
Yes, a few times.
Now, this is a very interesting opening. In fact, this has to be one of the most famous openings of all openings. Certainly is one of the most solid openings. I think every serious chess player should at least be familiar with this. Even though a chess player may not play this, should at least know what to do against this or how to play this. And you mentioned the name Ruy Lopez. Now, in English-speaking countries, I mean the United States, England, it's known, more commonly known as the Ruy Lopez opening. In most of the world, it's known as the Spanish opening.
Right, and the Ruy Lopez comes from a Spanish priest.
Yes, it was a 16th century Spanish priest named Ruy Lopez de Segura, who wrote a book. And this book appeared in 1561. This shows you how old this opening is. But of course, this opening was known even before he wrote the book. In 1561, in fact, it was the short title of the book was Libro del Juego del Ajedrez. And he was writing in response to a book that was written by Pedro Damiano 50 years earlier. 1512, in fact. 500 years ago, came out a book by this Pedro Damiano. And you know what Pedro Damiano said 500 years ago? He said knight c6 is the best move on the second move after knight f3 in this position. And Lopez, in his book, said this is inferior because it allows bishop b5. And because of that, they named this opening after Lopez or his homeland, Spain, Spanish opening. But again, every serious chess player should get to know this opening. So you know what Oppenheimer did in response to it? Well, actually, what can Black do here against bishop b5, the Spanish opening? Well, what are the choices?
Well, he can play knight to f6.
Yes, knight f6 is good. Yeah, it develops the piece, attacks the pawn on e4.
He could play a quiet d6.
d6, which Wilhelm Steinitz, the first official world champion, used to play originally, and then he modified his adoption. There's also bishop c5, which is a classical continuation. So there are a number of moves, but you know what Oppenheimer played is something that he must have learned when he studied chess. He played a6. He attacks the bishop. He puts the question to the bishop. And this is known as the Morphy defense, because our great American 19th century American player Paul Morphy advocated, hey, let's see what White's intentions are first before we do anything else. What's this bishop going to do?
Well, the bishop, of course, can retreat, but then it would make no sense to have played it out there in the first place if he's going to come back on the same diagonal. So he retreats back, he takes the bishop on b5 and comes back to a4, keeping pressure on this knight. There is kind of a distant possibility of swapping the bishop for the knight and then capturing this, but it's not a true capture. It would be an exchange.
Okay. Now, in response to this retreat, bishop a4, Black can still continue with knight f6. That's a possibility. Or play even d6, which is a deferred Steinitz defense. Steinitz actually advocated that later. But what Oppenheimer played on his fourth move was b5. He immediately attacks the bishop. So
now there's only one square to go to. And he has to play the bishop from a4 to b3, which is a perfectly good file to be diagonal to be on.
Look how this bishop is bearing down at Black's most vulnerable square. I mean, the pawn on f7. That's the it's the weakest square
because only the king defends it.
Exactly. So. All right. So after bishop b3, what Oppenheimer played now was knight f6. So he starts developing another piece. Knight f6. It does attack the pawn on e4. So what did Einstein do here?
Well, Einstein could develop his knight. He could play his queen pawn. He chooses to castle, which he's now cleared the area so that he can castle. It looks momentarily as though he's giving up this pawn because there's no, the knight to f6 move attacks the pawn. He doesn't defend it directly, he castles instead.
Right. Now here is what Oppenheimer, he had choices here. He could have played the bishop here to e7 followed by castling, or he could have played this bishop at the c5 with the idea of castling, or he could have even played bishop b7. This is okay. Or even d6 is playable. All these moves are good. The development of the bishop, of the dark squared bishop or the light squared bishop, or moving the d pawn, but instead he chose to take the pawn on e4. So knight takes e4. Now, this is is this dubious? I mean, it seems it's okay, but
Well, it looks okay. It looks as though he's won.
He's won a pawn. Okay.
But it'll certainly turn out to be dubious. Partly you look at it and say, well, it's not recommended to move the same piece twice in the opening, which is one thing that he's doing.
That's good advice, but
because
in general.
Because White is already slightly ahead in piece development.
Yes.
Also, it's not truly winning a pawn because the move that Einstein chose, taking the rook on f1 to e1, now attacks the knight, which puts the rook on the same file as the king. He's going to have to clear this out. Now he's going to run into a lot of pressure on his king from the white squared bishop, the knight, the rook, the queen will mobilize. It doesn't recommend.
Well, he's actually now allowed the rook to be activated here. Now this knight cannot retreat. The trouble with the knight retreating, if the knight retreats back to f6 or even c5, wherever it goes, this pawn on e5 will drop because we have a double attack on this pawn.
Right.
So what Oppenheimer chooses to do is play d5 and protect the knight on e4.
Knight, right.
All right, so he plays that. So what does Einstein do after d5?
Well, this position, first of all, is somewhat rare. It hasn't been played very often.
Yes.
In the past, some players have played knight to c3, which has a double attack on the pawn, double attack on the knight, and so on.
Right.
d3, threatening the knight right away.
Which would force the knight to move.
Force the knight to move.
Right.
Einstein chose an interesting move, and not a bad one, a2 to a4. It has some hidden features. If black takes and white takes with the bishop, there's a pin on the knight.
If this b-pawn took on a4, the bishop takes a4. Now we have the bishop attacking the undefended knight on, which happens to be defending the pawn on e5. So this would be very bad for black to take that pawn.
And also, he can't leave the pawn here and allow white to exchange because the black rook is unprotected.
All right. So what Oppenheimer did after a4, he pushed the pawn. He played b4.
Right.
So he avoids He avoids an exchange here of pawns. So what did Einstein do here now?
And then, and it was at this point, then he takes the pawn on d2 to play it to d3, threatening the knight.
And the knight now has to move. So what the knight does not go back to f6, but instead goes to c5. Knight c5, which in turn is attacking the bishop on b3.
Right.
All right, so what did Einstein do here?
Okay, so now he takes advantage of the rook on the e file and the double attack on the e5 pawn, and he takes back the pawn that he had given up earlier, plays knight take on e5.
Okay. Now Oppenheimer chooses not to take this. First of all, we have this very dangerous open file.
Well, there's a threat of winning the queen with knight takes c6.
Exactly.
So he has to do something.
So he chooses not to take this knight. Instead, he brings this knight on c6 back to e7, blocks the file, but at the same time adds another defender on the pawn on d5. Now that's rather awkward though, because
the king is caught in the middle here. It blocked the knight back there, blocks off the bishop. The d7 square is attacked by the knight. So what Einstein does, he takes his queen on d1, plays it to f3, and threatens checkmate on f7.
Oh yes, the queen coming down to f7, check, because the king cannot escape the d7 because the knight controls that square.
Right.
All right. So now here comes a turning point in the game. Here is where Oppenheimer has to defend this square right here, f7.
Right, he has to avoid the checkmate.
Okay, and what he could have done, probably should have done, was play this bishop on c8 and play it to e6, which at the same time defends the pawn on f7, but also adds another defender on the pawn on d5.
Right,
but he chose not to do that.
Right, that would have seemed that would hold the game.
I think that might have given him good defensive chances here.
Right.
But instead, what he did, he played the pawn on f7, plays it up to f6, and attacks the knight.
Attacks the knight. So
now he's going to regret this. We're going to see how this is going to be punished.
So, I mean, perhaps he was expecting that Einstein
he thought the knight was going to retreat.
Move somewhere, and they have to come back here, I guess.
Yep.
But by playing f6, he's opened up that f7, g6, h5 diagonal, Einstein takes advantage of it with queen to h5. Check.
Okay, so this is a serious weakening of this king side. This is a side that you really want to castle, and he could have castled early if he had played these moves with bringing the dark squared bishop out early. But now he's in big trouble, and he can't move the king because the king is the knight controls all these squares, so he has to block.
Right.
And he's not gonna block with the knight, because he's not gonna. If he brings the knight here,
he loses the queen.
He'll lose. In fact, the knight to c6, not the knight taking here, but stronger. Knight c6, the check, discover check, and it's going to win the queen.
Right.
So that is out of the question. So what he has to do, he has to block with the g pawn. He plays g6, attacks the queen.
Right.
All right. So now that's.
So now it looks as though there are two pieces under attack.
He's attacking both the knight and the queen.
Okay. But by playing, Einstein takes the knight on e5, takes the pawn on g6, cannot recapture with the knight because it's pinned by that rook on e1.
And the knight is attacking the rook.
Right.
Okay. So
and he can't just move the rook because then this becomes a threat again.
Another threat. Yes, right. Exactly. Actually, with mate, actually he'll lose more material.
Right.
So what he does, he chooses to give up what we call the exchange. An exchange in chess is when you're willing to give up a major piece, which is the rook, which is worth basically 5 pawns, 5 points, to a minor piece, which is worth 3 points, or 3 pawns. So he plays h takes g6.
Right.
So he's given up the exchange. He's giving up the exchange now because now Einstein plays queen.
He plays queen take.
Takes the rook.
h8.
All right. So he's lost. So Oppenheimer has lost the exchange, and so in turn, Oppenheimer now gets rid of this bishop on b3 by playing knight takes b3, and forces Einstein to recapture. C takes b3. Now we see that Einstein now is threatening to take this pawn on f6, which is undefended. So what Oppenheimer does, he plays the queen to d6. It's the only way he can protect that pawn. Right. Other than actually advancing, he could advance the pawn, but he chooses to activate this queen, defend here. Possible, if he can actually bring this bishop out, he's ready to castle, and he might be okay if he can castle on the queen side. But what does Einstein do here after queen d6?
Okay, after queen d6, he plays. He adds pressure to the bishop on f8. Now again, threatening
double attack on the bishop.
Right.
And he cannot defend. He can't move the bishop because he's pinned. He cannot defend the bishop again because there's no piece that can defend that bishop again. So what he chooses to do after bishop h6 is make a run for it. So here's where Oppenheimer plays king d7. Okay. He gets off the pin. All right, allowing Einstein to do what?
Then Einstein, he could capture with the queen, but he picks the best way to capture. He plays bishop on h6, takes f8, creating a new pin, this time the knight against the queen.
Okay. So after bishop takes f8, well, now what Oppenheimer does, he plays bishop b7. He bishop, which stops the bishop from taking, because the rook would win the queen.
Right.
But what does Einstein do in response to this?
Well, he needs to defend. He needs to get away from the pin. He needs to defend the bishop, and he adds to the attack on the knight by playing queen to g7.
Okay, so we actually have 3 pieces attacking this knight, which is only defended twice. So this knight needs to be defended again, and the only piece that can do that is playing this rook on a8 and play it to e8. So he plays the rook over and adds another defender to the knight. All right, so what does Einstein do here after rook e8?
Everything down here is, everything's pinned, everything's clogged. Right. So he needs to get more pieces into this. Okay. And so these 2 pieces haven't moved yet.
Right.
So he takes the knight on bishop 1, cannot play it to c3 or a3. He plays it to d2.
Okay. All right, so what Oppenheimer does after knight d2, he needs to give himself more space here to maybe try to escape here on this side. And also he plays c5, which defends the pawn on b4, but it's not under attack. But at least it actually connects these pawns here. And how does Einstein respond to this?
Okay,
c5?
so he takes his rook on a1 and he centralizes it, puts it on d1. So now it's on the same file as the queen and the king. Very kind of powerful
And
move.
this is a good move.
Oh, certainly. Not a
Would you recommend actually players, as far as with their rooks, if they can centralize rooks, connect the rooks,
Sure,
and keep them centralized?
Yep, especially with the king caught in the middle of the board.
The king is caught in the middle here. All right, so what Oppenheimer did after rook AD1, well, he just actually strengthens this pawn chain by playing A5. Possibly, maybe he's going to bring the bishop, vacating the square to bring the bishop here so he can attack this undefended pawn on D3. Right. But again, his moves are rather limited. He can't move anything here. He can't move this rook. He can't move the knight. He's paralyzed here, so he's only limited to basically moving pawns. Right. All right, so what did Einstein do? So
now we'll see the power of these rooks. He takes the knight on D2, and very interesting, he plays it to C4, which is protected by the pawn, but it also attacks the queen.
And you know the queen is here protecting along with the rook, this knight.
And but it's also right in front of the king.
Exactly. So he realizes if he moves the queen away, still protecting the pawn on F6, he's going to lose this knight with the attack with the rook or the bishop. So what he chooses to do is accept the sacrifice.
Right.
D takes C4. So now he is taking that sacrifice.
Right.
But now Einstein punishes it.
He plays D takes C4, now attacking the queen with that D1 rook.
Yeah, we have what we call like an X-ray. Right. This is an X-ray attack. He's skewered. I mean, you could call it a skewer. And now he realizes that he can't move the queen.
Can't move
so
away.
the best thing he can do, and he did it, was he took queen takes D1.
Right.
He
and
takes
the rook
there.
recaptures with check.
Right. All right. So now that forces now the king to move. He can't block with the bishop because he'll lose the bishop to the pawn here. So he moves the king to C8. Right so there.
Moves the defender away from the knight, and so Einstein takes the knight on E7.
And Oppenheimer throws in the towel.
Right.
He says, I've had enough.
He's a full queen down.
Full queen down, right, exactly. Full queen down, and he's going to lose more material. The bishop's attacking this undefended pawn. The queen is attacking this pawn. Everything, they're dropping like flies, as we say. Okay, so this was a game played, again, at Princeton, 1933. And Oppenheimer was 29 years old when this was played, and Einstein, I think, was 54.
Right.
I think it was a 25-year difference between their age. Now, getting back to Einstein, with the few minutes we have left, you mentioned that Einstein is noted for his theory of relativity, which he lectured on, I think, back in 1915.
Right.
He got, the Nobel Prize he won in 1921 wasn't for not for his theory of relativity, it was for some photoelectric effect, which he had done years before. But interesting about the theory of relativity, Emanuel Lasker, his good friend, that he knew from 1927, there was a pamphlet that came out in 1931 called 100 Authors Against Einstein. Right. Lasker was one of the authors who said that Einstein's theory of relativity was wrong. Right. Why did he say that?
Well, as far as I understand, it was that he didn't. In order for Einstein's theory to work, you had to work in a perfect vacuum.
Right.
And Lasker did not believe that a perfect vacuum was possible.
It would actually affect the speed of light.
Right.
In fact, because of the particles in space,
right.
the speed of light would be limited because of these particles in space. Right. So it's interesting that Lasker, his good friend, he stayed friends with Lasker. Lifetime friends. When they both were in this country, they would visit each other, and they would play chess with each other, casual games.
And Einstein wasn't offended by the criticism. He didn't.
Okay. Well, again, I thought that was rather interesting. That Lasker would be one of the authors of this pamphlet that would say, "Oh, Albert, you're wrong. This theory of relativity is all wrong. You haven't figured out the fact that there is no perfect vacuum." All right. So again, this is an interesting game. I hope our viewers enjoyed this historic game. We wanted to present it because it shows you that even amateur players, such as Einstein was, he was an amateur player, and he certainly knew opening theory. Yeah. He certainly knew the Spanish opening. Okay. So, yeah. Okay. Well, as I say, chess fans, I hope you join us next time for another edition of Chess Chat. We'll present to you a very interesting game for your review, and it should be a very instructional game. See you next time on Chess Chat.